Arriving at prison, I remember the process clearly. We got off the bus and were herded into a reception area called Block 16. Whilst there, they made us strip down, a bunch of us standing butt naked, while the officers did their checks. It was no-nonsense stuff. After that, you'd approach the desk for fingerprinting and processing. It was there, you'd make a crucial decision. Some guys, like this one I saw, they'd come up to the desk, look the officer dead in the eye, and say something like, "I don't think I'll make it in general population." At that point, the officer would ring a bell, and they'd be moved somewhere else, away from the regular crowd. But if you stayed quiet, like most did, you'd be led to a cell with a cage attached. In that cage, you'd sit for hours, sometimes the whole day, as they sorted you out. I remember the bell ringing often. People freaking out and rushing to the desk to ring the bell, only to end up in a smaller, darker cell out of earshot from the rest of us. It was scorching that day, probably over 100 degrees outside, and you're just cramped inside that cell. Lunchtime came, and we got sandwiches. I'll admit, the food was better than the county's cheap stuff. I recall one meal particularly, chicken enchiladas with green sauce. It tasted real, like something that might actually fatten you up. There were some wild characters in there, no doubt about it. They knew there was a white guy among us, they'd seen him on the bus. This guy named Reggie, he didn't have any weapon. We'd just come on transport, but he was busy sharpening a pencil like a man on a mission. He took his sweet time, and when he was good and ready, he jammed that pencil right into the neck of another guy. It was the first day in reception, and he just went at it, puncturing holes in the other guy's neck, and that guy went down fast. I was there, watching it all, thinking this trip was going to be one heck of a ride. In those cramped cages, we'd munch on our sandwiches, the stifling heat suffocating us. It had to be a scorching 110 degrees, at least. Finally, they'd come to move you from that holding cell to your assigned one. That's when it got real. You'd be alone in that cell for 10 long days. No contact with anyone. Reception was like a test. They needed to figure out who you were and where you belonged. Everyone always asks about the first day in prison, and this was the reality. The real deal, right there in reception. You'd roll in, be herded into that cramped cell with a bunch of strangers until they processed you, and then you'd be placed in your solitary cell, waiting for your fate to be decided. During my 2 weeks in that cell, I noticed some graffiti on the wall. Someone had drawn SpongeBob SquarePants and scribbled the lines of the theme song. It made you think about the kind of people you were about to join. 2 weeks of isolation were the norm. I had to be patient until they figured out my custody level, who I was, and where I was headed. Meanwhile, I thought about the simple things, like how that sandwich I had in reception was a rare taste of normalcy. Block 17 is within walking distance of reception, and this block was a constant source of trouble. I end up with this standalone skinhead as my cellmate. He claims to be a skinhead but isn't officially affiliated, he just labels himself. And let me tell you, we had our fair share of issues. This guy used to be a massive dude, easily tipping the scales at 260 pounds, but he lost a ton of weight, way too fast, leaving him with all this saggy extra skin. Initially, he seemed alright, but then he ended up in debt with the wrong people and started acting out. Him being in debt was bad for me, because the trouble would come to my cell, and I didn't want that. Every time food came around, I'd wolf down as much as I wanted, even if it was his. That's where the real problems began. He got all worked up because of some peanut butter. I wanted that peanut butter all to myself, and I made it clear to him, saying, "Hey, buddy, none of this is for you. It's mine. Get lost." Well, he didn't take too kindly to that. From there our tensions boiled over, and I can't even remember how it escalated, but we started throwing punches. Then, this overweight fellow managed to get me in some sort of guillotine chokehold, shoving my neck down while applying pressure to the back of my head. I was furious. I yelled, "I'm going to murder you when you release me, fatty." My neighbor, Scooby, heard the commotion through the vent. He hollered over, asking if everything was all right. I replied, telling him Mike's got his fat titties choking me out. The moment he frees me, I'm going to lay a beating on his fat ass. Mike finally started easing up on my neck, cautioning me not to do anything stupid. I snapped back, nah, the second he lets go, I'm unleashing hell on this bitch. Eventually, he released me, and, as expected, I swung at him, landing a few solid hits. He sat there afterward, sporting a bloody nose and a swollen lip, asking if everything was settled. I told him he was a punk, and yes, it was settled. Then there's this other incident. I'm just minding my own business when one of the higher-ranking skinheads strolls up. He's repping SKS or something, which is a white clique of skinheads. He eyeballs me and says, "You've got a Jewish tat?" I shot back, "Yeah, I've got the King of Jews tatted on me." "What's up, you punk? Got a problem?" Right then and there, he punked out in front of everyone. He let me straight up call him a punk, basically folded like a cheap suit. I glanced around, thinking, this dude's toast. In prison, especially as a white guy, you cannot let anyone call you a punk. Whether it's a fellow white guy or anyone else joking around, you've got to fire back at them. There's no other option. If you don't, well, like I mentioned earlier, you're getting messed up. That's just how it rolls in the penitentiary. In the end, it was all about manipulation. Some people would manipulate the system to their advantage, even if it meant getting in trouble or putting their lives at risk. It was a dangerous game, and you couldn't trust anyone fully. The wildest part of this whole scene was my neighbor, 2 cells down. They start rounding up all the white guys, and it's strip search time. Now, this guy, he's got a 7-inch blade hanging out of his ass. As they strip us down, he's got it tucked halfway in a plastic bag, the handle barely sticking out. It's a monstrous knife, the kind you'd never believe could fit where it does. You might be thinking, that's some sickening stuff, who shoves a 7-inch knife up their ass? But this is the stark reality of prison. You're dealing with people who don't think like you. This dude is ready to do whatever it takes, even if it means using that knife, whether it's on a fellow inmate or a damn cop. So, yeah, he did what he had to do. All of this was within a few weeks of being there. Sounds sick? Yeah, well then don't end up in prison. Punk. When you first get arrested, you go into a processing sequence of cells called the horseshoe, and basically, this is for new arrestees. You're in these cells for days, and you don't know what day it is. All you can feel is the heat rising and falling, and you're crammed in, like sardines with 40 or 50 people. Fights are breaking out, there's blood on the walls, and guards are rushing in, grabbing people, especially those acting up on drugs. If you really act up, the guards grab you and put you in a restraint chair. It looks like a medieval torture device. They tilt it back, strap you in, and put a hood on your head. There are people out there in chairs just howling and whining. It sounds like something out of a horror film. Yeah, it's pretty wild. Then, you get to see the judge, and I got sent over to medium security in the beginning, which is completely gang and drug infested. So as soon as I get there, some skinhead dudes are eyeing me up. They're like, "We want a word with you in that cell back there." You can't say no, because in prison, you don't have much of a choice. They're sizing you up, and you look like their type of recruit. Not because I wanted to, but because I'm white, and in prison, you get affiliated with one of the racial gangs whether you like it or not. It's like that for all races, whites, blacks, Mexicans, Mexican Americans. I didn't know this yet, but I had to do what they said, so I went into the cell. They ask, "What are your charges?" And I've got the printout, but it's all in legal speak, so I don't understand it. So I tell them, I've got my charges, but I don't know what they mean. And they freak out and start pushing me against the wall, shouting, "What do you mean you don't know what it means? Are you a chomo?" I don't know what a chomo is either, so I'm digging my grave here. They've got me up against the wall about to smash me, and I'm making it worse because I don't know how to behave in prison. I tell them to look at my sheet and they take it and look, and they see I've got drug charges. They see my bail is nearly $1 million, and they love that. They ask me who I killed to get a bail that high. They relaxed and started to joke with me. Suddenly they accepted me and let me go. I learned later that Chelmo meant you were a child predator. One of the guys who came in with me actually did have those charges. So the next day they ask me about him and I tell them I know nothing. Later I hear someone being beat in the shower area, and it's the skinhead gang that questioned me, and they leave this guy in there, just whimpering in a pool of blood. This big guy says to them as they're leaving, "How come we can still hear him?" And the head of the skinhead says, "We smashed him good." And the big guy says, "Not good enough." So he goes in and it's like he's trying to crack this guy's head open like a coconut. You can just hear the stomping echoing. Crack. Crunch. The guy looks dead and a guard doing a security walk eventually finds him. He was carried on a stretcher. He had blood and yellow stuff coming out of his head, like brain fluid or something. It was every day after that, just violence. I had to get used to the sound of heads getting bashed against toilets, bodies being thrown around, people getting carried out on stretchers. They'd wait until the guards did the security walk so that they'd have the most amount of time possible to torture these child predators. One guy, after they were done with him, came out covered in blood. He managed to get down the stairs and knock on the window to the guards, and they opened the door and he just collapsed. There was an old man who wouldn't stop rambling, so the gangs thought they'd shut him up. I walked past him and there was blood splurting out the back of his head. So he was dealt with as far as they were concerned. All of this within a week of being in prison. You had to toughen up fast or you were done for. I've never been to prison, but I did spend a few days in a county jail. It was a community holding area, which meant we all slept together in one room with rows of bunk beds. I'm the quiet, invisible type, so I managed to get by pretty well. I sort of befriended a few guys by teaching them chess, playing blindfolded matches, and sharing my food. I didn't eat much during the week I was there. Around day 3, a new guy joined our group. He was a short, muscular guy in his 20s, and he had a Napoleon complex written all over him. I did my best to keep my distance, considering I'm a scrawny white guy who didn't know how to defend himself. I had some bad allergies at the time and couldn't stop sneezing. After every single sneeze, even during a series of them, Napoleon would say, "Bless you," and I'd respond with a polite, "Thank you." It became a repetitive back and forth of, "Achoo, bless you, thank you." But then, one time, I started sneezing and didn't manage to say thank you after each blessing. That's when things went haywire. Napoleon exploded with anger, charging at me from across the room, yelling obscenities, and raising his fists. My friends from earlier, the ones I'd taught chess and shared meals with, sprang into action. They rushed over and tackled him before he could reach me. There was a brawl, fists flying, until the guards finally intervened and broke up the fight. Napoleon was promptly sent to isolation. He's lucky that I didn't press charges.